we are recording this meeting, so if you don't want to be part of the recording, you may turn off your cameras. And all right, so this is the main first thing, because I usually forget when I do like a lecture or something to start the recording. So I'm glad that I've done that. Okay, so welcome to everyone to the third Early Career Scholars Debate, which is a joint event with the Public Diplomacy Interest Group at the International Communication Association and the International Communication Section at the International Studies Association. Okay, so please, if you're not part of these groups, I really strongly suggest you to join these growing groups. They're like both like they are part of like they are very amazing people part of these groups, and there's really a collegial environment. So yeah, if you want to join, this is a good opportunity to think about it. I'm Luigi Di Martino, and I'm a public diplomacy scholar at the Western Sydney University, and I will be chairing the debate. So I was just would like to start. I would like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this debate from the lens of the Tharawal peoples. And I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands of which you all work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people participating in this online debate. I want to pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connection to the lands and waters of Australia. All right, so the debate today, we are lucky to have with us Dr. Lisa Tam, and I hope I'm going to pronounce it right, Dr. Eric Watawoskis. Is that right, Eric?
Almost nailed it.
Almost. Okay, so Lisa is a senior lecturer in advertising and public relations at the Queensland University of Technology, the business school. And Eric is a researcher, is a research fellow and visiting lecturer at the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs, School of International Regional Studies at HSC University. I'm just gonna get in another couple of people. Okay. So as if you are familiar with the format of this debate, because this is already the third one, you know that with this debate we want to promote early career scholars and their work and their research. And also, we want to engage with in a critical debate on issues dominating the fields of public diplomacy and international communication. Okay, the debate will last around 1 hour, so we were thinking to do like a little like a bit shorter than the previous debates, and really the goal of the debate is to start a conversation. So we're gonna roughly take around half an hour, for the first two presentations. Then we're gonna open the floor to all the participants for questions or comments. The question that we are debating today, as you can see on the screen, is as trust in social media crumbles, are these platforms still adequate for public diplomacy? And as you know, diplomacy, along with several other governmental activities, has been altered by the internet in two key ways. First, the internet has changed what diplomats do to engage with publics, and also it has changed the actors who influence or are engaged with diplomacy. So with the introduction of internet in public diplomacy, in particular of social media, academics have begun to consider those digital technology as a factor that has empowered new actors in the international stage, resulting in calls for a dialogic model of public diplomacy. However, new questions about the quality, the accuracy, and the accessibility of news and content on social media have emerged. For example, we're all familiar with the work of Pfizer, and the work on filter bubbles. We also are all familiar of the debate around fake news that started with the USA election in 2016. And we also are familiar with new phenomena like social media bots that create and produce automatically message on social media, which are not capable of disrupting, of creating disruptive propaganda in social and online media, and the application of bots is even suspected to be partly responsible for some of the recent election results, especially with Brexit. We also have the recent revelation of the Facebook whistleblower that confirmed what scholars have been arguing for a while, in particular scholars in media and communication, which is to say that the design of social media platforms reflects a focus on profits rather than on user well-being or on democratic deliberation. So the debate about the potential of and the bias within social media technology is therefore it's critical to understand the environment where diplomatic activities take place, and that's important implication for the study of digital communication in public diplomacy. So this is more or less where our question comes from. All the issues there, very briefly are related with our question. I'm going to just stop sharing my screen, and I would like to invite Lisa to start with the debate.
Thank you for the introduction, Luigi. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. As Luigi said, my name is Lisa. I'm a senior lecturer at the QUT Business School in Brisbane, Australia. As an academic in advertising and public relations, I will be sharing my viewpoints from a communication perspective. And I will be advocating that social media are still trustworthy platforms which are adequate for public diplomacy. First, I would like to share my definitions of public diplomacy. Public diplomacy refers to the efforts made by countries to build and cultivate relationships with foreign publics. According to Guy Golan's integrated approach to public diplomacy, these efforts can include mediated public diplomacy using paid, earned, owned, and shared media platforms. And these efforts can also include relational public diplomacy programs, such as educational and cultural exchange programs. In this integrated approach, the use of social media is critical for mediated public diplomacy for countries to participate in conversations with foreign publics. These conversations can be one way, serving the purpose of solely informing foreign publics, or they can be two-way, serving the purpose of listening to foreign publics and engaging with them. The most important thing is that these conversations have to have a purpose. It's not about participating in conversations for the sake of it, but it serves the purpose of advancing the relationship between a country and its foreign publics. And when a country has a good relationship with its foreign publics, it will be able to identify and work towards achieving shared goals. In other words, the recipe to success in the relationship requires two things: actions and communication. One does not work well without the other. Now, you may want to ask, then how can we say that digital platforms, which are solely for communication, are adequate for public diplomacy? The reality is that most publics do not have an opportunity to engage with the country, whether it is receiving information or expressing opinions outside of digital platforms. Guy Golan's integrated approach to public diplomacy articulates that relational public diplomacy programs, such as educational and cultural exchanges, are only experienced by a small number of people. So communication practices such as advertising and public relations are still critical to reaching more people and promoting shared understanding between a country and its foreign publics. So in this respect, current research has examined how both embassies and publics use social media platforms. On one hand, embassies are found to be using social media platforms mostly for promoting information and advocacy. On the other hand, publics actually do the same thing. They use social media platforms to express their views and advocate for their views. Therefore, social media platforms are actually online public spheres where different ideas are expressed and contested by both government agencies and publics. However, how government agencies such as embassies manage their social media pages for diverse views to be expressed and deliberated, and how they actually act on those views afterwards are possible research questions that we need to explore in the future. So up to now, I've shared with you that social media platforms are important for public diplomacy because they are useful for building and cultivating relationships with foreign publics in order to achieve shared goals. And they are useful for engaging with foreign publics who may not have an opportunity to participate in other public diplomacy programs. Particularly, government agencies can potentially generate conversations about issues and engage in discussion with issue publics to understand what their views are. Ideally, they can identify shared values and interests and act on them accordingly. I would like to share with you a story that I think is successful. The United States is quite advanced in digital diplomacy. The social media pages of the US embassies and consulates in Australia mostly promote messages of shared goals. That is, Australia and the United States having been working together on things like trade relations, military collaboration, and human rights. We can see a variety of opinions expressed on this post. Some of them are negative towards the collaborations, but these negative posts are actually important for public diplomacy because these posts help government agencies identify points of similarities and dissimilarities and points of agreements and disagreements. This will help them further identify and work towards shared goals through relationship building. After all, it's not about achieving consensus. Social media allows government agencies and foreign publics to use the power of communication to advocate for their views and even express resistance to policies. Social media is a platform for dissensus, which should be embraced. There are two more problems that I need to address here. We know that trust in social media platforms has plummeted in recent years, and the trend is unlikely to reverse anytime soon. It could be risky to have a presence on social media or even express our views on social media. Our views can be harvested for marketing purposes. Despite this low trust, research has shown that people continue to use social media, especially for accessing news and political information. Both opinion leaders and opinion seekers are still active on social media platforms. Another thing that I need to bring up is that trust in social media platforms is not equivalent to trust in the organizations or entities which have a presence on social media platforms. I do not trust Facebook, but I trust the social media page of Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade as an official source of credible information. And another problem that I need to address here is the problem of adequacy. In fact, I think it's hard to measure adequacy in this context, but I can confidently argue that without social media, it will be hard to achieve the desired goals of public diplomacy. One of my publications has examined the interpersonal approaches to public diplomacy that was exhibited on the Facebook page of the US consulate in Hong Kong. I'm originally from Hong Kong. I highlighted that the Consul General at that time, Clifford Hart, displayed his engagement in many activities, which showed how he was working towards building relationships with local people and organizations in Hong Kong. He was also promoting the values shared by the US and Hong Kong people. In communication, we call these parasocial interactions. Parasocial interactions are defined as a type of intimate, friend-like relationship that occurs between a mediated persona and a viewer. It is formed through media consumptions. For example, I'm obviously not friends with the US Consul General in Hong Kong, but by watching how he engages with Hong Kong people online and offline, I feel that I have a parasocial relationship with him, such that I know him as a friend. Research has shown that the higher the media consumption, the more likely that people find these parasocial interactions gratifying. A positive relationship between the consul general and local people can translate into a positive relationship between an embassy or a consulate and foreign publics in a host country. Last but not least, although I'm supposed to advocate that social media is adequate for public diplomacy, I must emphasize that it should not be the only platform for public diplomacy. The content being shared on social media requires substance that potentially can be information about public diplomacy activities or joint country collaborations. At the same time, as a scholar who advocates for integrated communication, there are other paid, earned, and owned channels which should be used in combination with shared platforms to create synergistic effects in motivating foreign publics to engage with the country. Thank you for hearing my side of the story from a communication perspective.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm just gonna pass the ball to X.
I'm uploading first to Lisa. You can hear me well, right? Great.
Yeah.
So, dear colleagues, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to participate in this debate. It seems to me that the topic that Ilan and Luigi came up with and formulated is extremely relevant. And while discussing this topic, I should say that I'm rather pessimist in this discussion. Before we begin with my point of view, I want to note that that a large proportion of public diplomacy scholars, they tend to come from communications background primarily, and I'm from a little bit different camp. I have a background in international relations, political science, and a little bit social sciences. So I will build up my argument from these perspectives and share my pessimistic ideas with you. To begin with, the key concepts in this question of the appropriateness of social platforms for public diplomacy that I will use are trust, security, and national identity. Let's start a little bit with history. We have not lived with internet for long, but it has become one of the key components of our lives. And if we look at how social platforms have developed historically, we can see that they all had certain window of opportunity to become a platform for exchange of opinions, to enjoy freedom of speech, and at the same time, they became platforms for diplomacy, communications, even for those actors that are non-state actors, right? What is important, though, in this matter is that there was access to freedom of speech. And in this way, Facebook, Twitter, or Russian Vkontakte, other platforms, it was possible to find friends of interests from different corners of the world to cooperate with them. But this window of opportunity tends to shrink and disappear. In particular, this happens when a regulator comes on the stage. The regulator is usually a body within a government, whatever authority. So, for example, regulators block sites of enemy states. As for example, South Korea blocks sites of the North, or Russia prohibits viewing some sites of the United States or Ukraine. Some countries block certain content on sites. For example, in Thailand, you cannot read the Wikipedia page about their king. Also, we all know about the famous Chinese firewall, and which restricts access to social platforms. And of course, North Korean internet, which only works in North Korea. Of the harsher measures would be arrests for likes and comments that usually discredit the image of the government, or arrests for spreading dangerous information, for example, calling for radical extremist activities. All of these examples sound like they come from authoritarian states, not Western democracies. Well, for the most part, they are, but they are also, in the world, there are more non-democratic states than democracies, right? At the same time, Western state authorities also regulate the activities of social platforms. For example, by gaining access to users' personal data, or persecuting or interrogating corporate internet corporation owners, let's say hi to Mark, manipulation by doing some manipulations of search algorithms, wiretapping, surveillance of their citizens. Thus, social media platforms have this small window of opportunity where they can serve as a platform for public diplomacy, or serve at least as a stepping stone to negotiations and cooperations between non-state actors, as long as they can speak freely. But this window is limited to the moment when state authorities will want to control the agendas and information flows on the given platform. Let's imagine that social platforms are rooms where we can gather and negotiate, just like real rooms with brick walls, chairs, whatever. If in the past the phrase that walls have ears was greeted with some perplexed stare from the public, and people would say, "Oh, Eriks, you're paranoid, you're crazy, man." Today, with formation of digital rooms that social platforms are, it is no longer a paranoid thought. Digital rooms have digital ears that collect and analyze spoken and written information. It is no longer a secret that smartphones or smart TVs collect information for marketing strategies. So why can't government agencies do the same for own goals? Well, actually they can and they do. And many have the so-called access to backdoor access to social platforms. Just a couple days ago, French President Emmanuel Macron, went to chat in person with Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, the prince. Couldn't they just text each other on WhatsApp? Of course they couldn't, because there are issues that they discuss, they are resolved behind closed doors in person. Or recently we had this COP26, COP26. Negotiations were also conducted there behind closed doors, sometimes at night and in person. Why? For the same reasons. The content of negotiation processes should not be leaked. In the early 2000s, states were not so quick and thoughtful about digital platforms, but now states will impose their regulations more actively, thus reducing the potential for social platforms to be a public diplomacy instrument. This is because states do not trust their citizens. This is because the states do not trust each other, and therefore they're preoccupied with these ideas of security. And also the state itself is interested in reproducing itself and preserving previous structures within itself. So it is afraid to hand over reins to non-governmental organizations that might emerge in the public, in social media. When it comes to security, states have been obsessed with security for a long time, but not that much as today. And under the pretext of protection from pernicious influence from the outside and protection of national interests, states try to secure their citizens from themselves. Today, everything is digitalized and easily controlled. And I'm not just talking about eavesdropping and analysis and checking of information flows. I'm like just imagine if you misbehave in this digitalized world, the state can restrict access to bank accounts. It is digitalized. It can restrict access to hospital appointments or even just public transport and so on. Several books, several scholars mentioned that that there was transition from old public diplomacy to new public diplomacy, and one of the argument for it was that diplomatic agencies, official diplomatic agencies, they could not cover all channels and areas of communication. So we have NGOs in public diplomacy that partially, at least, carrying out these functions. Times are changing and empire is striking back. With more digitalization and algorithmization, states can control the dialogue and behavior of actors online more and more. Does this situation leave us without public diplomacy? Debatable question. The problem here is that with growing control from the state authorities over social networks and social media, we're losing public as a subject of public diplomacy. We're losing public as a bottom-up, self-organizing pusher of change in the society at national and global levels. This situation will leave us with public as an object, no problem with it, as an object of public diplomacy or a context, but not the subject. We also can still enjoy public diplomacy, especially one that is monitored, controlled, and commissioned by states. Is it suitable for us? Are we happy with it? Well, it depends on the context, but we have to understand that states are trying to protect themselves, their national interests, and reproducing uniformly uncritical and unreflective fellow citizens who will not get in the way of narrow-minded and short-term state goals, national interests, and of the people in power is one of the tasks of the states. We live in the 21st century with access to different sources of information, and many of us understand that we are in the same boat and many global problems must be solved collectively, right? For example, the problems with climate change, pollution of the planet, etc. Who are main decision makers in this case? Well, for example, again, with COP26, we can say that the main decision makers are states, which are led by specific people with their own personal interests, who tend to exist in information bubbles, sometimes who hold quite paranoid ideas, global ambitions, and nationalistic ideals. To solve climate problems, state must, for example, to solve climate problems, state must give up some of their sovereignty. For example, the control over resources. Are they willing to do so? No. Will they do so? No. Of course not. Some will not be ready because corruption schemes and personal responsibility will be uncovered because this globalization causes transparency. And some will still operate on the idea of national interests. So therefore, states and the leaders at their head are interested in this new social platforms and social media as a tool for propaganda and national interest-driven public diplomacy, and as an instrument of control of the population at certain limit, but not in social platforms that generate movements that will threaten their influence. Yeah, so I think at these unhappy and unexciting note, I will finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I think I really like where you took the the discussion, and it sounds like that for my perception is that there's this dichotomy between publics and states. So whether we focus more on the national interest, or is like public diplomacy, the goal of public diplomacy focusing on publics rather than national interest. So I guess which is it's connected in terms of how do we frame, I guess, social media as tools of public diplomacy. So Liz, I'm gonna just hand it to you if you want to respond a couple of minutes, and then Eric's, and then we're gonna open up the floor for questions and comments.
Yeah, I have learned a lot from Eric's discussion. Those are all the points that I didn't think of. It was great that you're a pessimist, because I am an idealist when it comes to the use of communication to advance relationships. So it was great that you pointed out that the states would mostly focus on their own interests, so they wouldn't want collectives or publics to be formed on social media against them. That's something that I didn't think of. So that was awesome. Thank you very much. And I also learned other things, such as the fact that not that many people can actually have access to social media platforms because of countries' regulations, and that some people actually cannot speak freely. And the fact that social media platform can be platforms where countries collect information for their own purposes, rather than as I said, advancing shared goals or identifying shared goals. So I have learned a lot. And the other thing is that you also talked about how ideally social media should be a place where people can discuss their ideas and negotiate their ideas. But I think from many diplomatic agencies' social media pages that I have seen, they actually have not fulfilled that purpose. They have not done that. So sometimes they throw out a question, like, how do you celebrate Thanksgiving? And then people just tell them like how they celebrate Thanksgiving, but there is no deliberation, there's no discussion. And they normally only discuss cultural issues. They don't discuss political issues. They don't really discuss policies. So at the end of the day, I do doubt from time to time whether social media conversations actually lead to actions or policies that reflect shared goals and shared interests afterwards. So thank you very much for the discussion. I agree 100% on the points that you have proposed, and I have learned a lot from the discussion, so thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Eric.
Oh, I made so many notes on Liza's speech. Yeah, it was so great because I'm not a communication scholar, but I'm assigned to teach communication class soon. So I need to learn from you too. And it is, on the one hand, I would like to highlight that from the communication perspective, what Lisa mentioned is like totally true. I absolutely see like how it should work, and it is more idealistic perspective. But when Lisa went into cases, it was interesting that you mentioned these United States and Australia web pages, and again it pulls down the discussion to the framework that public diplomacy is produced by the states. The interests, there is a state-state discussion, state is the main subject, and public becomes an object. So there is not that much room for public to be a subject in social media. Also, again, you mentioned in your speech, and confirmed it actually in this comment, I believe there is a huge problem with listening for states in social media, the perspectives of public. So they might throw the question on this Thanksgiving, and they they even will provide some multiple choice answers, and they will collect some statistics, but who cares? What else? It would be nice to publish maybe afterwards this data as a part of a national branding report, but that's it. And this national branding report will serve national goals, right? Also, the biggest thing that I liked most of all in Liz's speech is that you mentioned these parasocial relations, and now I'll become more boring. Let's go into academic perspective. This is probably where research in public diplomacy should go to, in studying these micro-social mechanisms of how ideas are delivered, whether they're consumed, how they're processed, and how they impact the behavior. So we eventually will turn into behavioralism one day. Yeah, and yeah, probably that's it. Thank you so very, very much. It was great.
Yeah, well done to both of you. I think it's yeah, there are a lot of fundamental questions that you touched on. So well done to both of you. And I would like to open up the discussion to the other participants. If you have any question, you can raise your hands, or you can use the chat if you like. Nancy, I think you want to say something, right?
Well, actually, I would love for anybody else to go ahead of me, but I was invited to comment, and I just want to thank you all for the research that you put into this and how much I learned. I hadn't really thought about parasocial. I think I'm parasocial every day, but I just didn't have a name for it. And also, aren't we at different times idealists, pessimists, realists, critical types? You know, we have this whole spectrum in public diplomacy, and I think that's what you all are examining here. I really loved, Lisa, your comment about the necessity for having negative feedback, these negative posts that often, having worked inside the government, and this is sort of at the very beginning of the internet and long before the social media platforms, but we were from the inside looking out, we were about controlling information. We wanted boundaries. And yet, what is the sort of sacred term that we associate with public diplomacy so often is engagement. And engagement can be chaotic. It can be dissenting. And and Isabel well knows, when I was in Sweden and I gave a talk on gender perspectives on diplomacy, I got trolled for the first time ever in my life. And this was in a closed webinar, but it was because gender is a contested term. And, you know, there was a part of me that would have wanted to let the troll in and let's have a little discourse. Let's see how legitimate this is, because sometimes trolling can be sort of fear-driven. Just it could be somebody, you know, flame throwing and then they just want to get off the platform. But it can also be possibly an opportunity to engage, but you have to be more of a risk taker. And I think for many of us in institutions, we're not too risk taking, but I like that. And also the comment you made, Lisa, in your response to Eric's about the, you know, how did you celebrate your Thanksgiving? And then people go to the trouble to post, but then there's just no response to people giving you their time. And anybody who's active on social media, you know, it's about that interactive aspect. And I see governments and PR institutions that work with governments, they're often very lax about that. So they may rhetorically refer to engagement and then not really practice it. And Eric's, you know, I'm political science IR, so you know my heart is with you here. And you raise a lot of those critical questions again about trust. I'm thinking now the Freedom House report that came out, and how democracy now is becoming a contested term we see internationally. So social media platforms are certainly no panacea. The content and the way that we utilize them, if we're going to use the P word, which I challenge too, I think they're media companies, but then we have to really think about what our end goals are. And I think for both of you, sounds like the end goals are about creating a better society, working with collaborative partners, because so many of our problems now are really shared problems. So how are we going to do that? And let's think about what public diplomacy can do to contribute with both of your perspectives brought on board. So there's a great integration between your two presentations here. And I really thank you all for inviting me to be part of this.
Thank you, Nancy. If Lisa makes very briefly, if you have anything to say on this, and otherwise I'm gonna move on with the questions. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for your feedback. Thank you so much for your feedback, Nancy. As an idealist, I would really love to learn from a petitioner about how we can put these ideals in practice. So in public relations, we have talked about how we want petitioners to be more ethical by promoting dissensus within the organizations and to be good at risk management. So after we listen, we present the different views to the organizations, but then the organizations will be the ones who make decisions about how to act on them. So there is still limited work in this area, so it would be great for us to continue learning from public diplomacy practitioners or diplomats on how they actually practice this in real life.
Yeah, Alex.
What I like about this kind of event, that people are kind of stimulating each other thinking. And Nancy mentioned time, and like very important concept. And here we should quote Linkin Park, time is a valuable thing. So I would like actually to, this concept, Nancy's concept, and then Nancy's comment stimulates me to think about how in future, maybe in the nearest future, users of these platforms will not only watch their language because of issues that I mentioned before, but also limit their presence and limit their time spending on typing comments and in participating on it. Because in nowadays, our world is transforming into the super fast speed. It is non-humane, and we're trying to accept to consume as much content as possible. Like TikTok is the best depiction of it. And at certain point, people who are on a TikTok will not even be able, will not have enough time to like it, or not only to comment, but even to like it. So this avenue for new research is very, very delicious in future, I believe. So thank you, Nancy, for nudging me on this thought.
All right, thank you. Is there any other question? Okay, Zhao and then Phil. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this really interesting discussion, Lisa and Eric's. As a communication scholar, so I suppose, yeah, maybe I followed Lisa's point of views. Because I use also some kind of PR perspective to question public diplomacy practice in order to know how the government mobilize social media platform to to circulate some emotional elements to engage foreign publics. But sometimes I also confused about that because when we talk about social media and when we talk about whether social media is still adequate for public diplomacy, for me, indeed, no media channel is perfect, and so are social media platforms. In an area without social media, some governments can also manipulate the media to achieve the purpose of international political propaganda. So today, these ancient or former techniques are just only being renewed and digitalized for a new practice of propaganda. It becomes more precious because of big data and algorithms. Like Eric said, the TikTok, for example, this is Chinese some technology, so I know it very, very well. Therefore, I was thinking, should we discuss more from an ethical point of view related to public diplomacy practice, especially for the future of public diplomacy practice? In other words, for practitioners of public diplomacy, is there a need for professional standards or deontology? I don't know if my thinking is more is too ideal. After all, the professionalism of public diplomats is not like other professions like public PRs. So this is an exceptional profession in defending a government interest and some ideology. So I have no idea if this idea could be applied for our scholarship. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Zhao. And this is really connected also with my question that I wanted to ask. So I'm just gonna say it now, and this way you can answer to both of us. It is, in relation, the frustration that I found, in my research is that when you look at engagement or listening, it never happened. So I'm still, looking for a case study, for best practices, to say, look, this is, perfect engagement. This is, perfect listening. And, some of the reason probably is because, as Nancy was saying, it's messy. So it's difficult, to evaluate in a way. So I guess also think about, in terms of how we can finally, make, translate, academic discourse and theory into practices. How do we, build this gap? I guess it's a huge question, but it would be interesting, to know, well, what is like your idea in this sense and suggestion to move forward, and try to bridge this gap. Lisa and Eric, I think it's connected with Zhao question as well.
Should I respond?
Yeah.
So I think one of the most interesting things about social media effects is that like we manage engagements by, a lot of people manage engagements by looking at how many likes a post has got or how many responses a post has got. But then most social media users are actually lurkers who don't leave any comments or any traces at all. And we actually need to look into the effects of the social media post on these lurkers. And it's very hard though, unless we do an experiment, but still it's not real, it's still an experiment. And I think in response to the ethics question, I have been thinking about whether we should have an evaluation framework in public diplomacy that actually measures the extent to which our posts generate dissensus. So whether our posts lead to different ideas being expressed and different ideas being contested. So in public relations, it's not possible to measure the outputs or outcomes of our social media efforts that way. But in public diplomacy, it will be interesting if we can actually measure dissensus as an ideal outcome or output of our social media efforts. And the other thing is, can we also measure whether the social media conversations will end up being considered by the diplomatic agencies and whether they will end up being actions taken by diplomatic agencies. And that will be my ideal of ethics on digital diplomacy.
Thank you, Lisa.
The Zhao's question and your Luigi's adding is very, very interesting, especially if we match ideology and ethics. And as you might guess, ethics and ideology actually they're married in terms that both of them, they have some moral values. And if we go into further analysis, probably let's say Chinese perception of public diplomacy and Chinese ethics towards public diplomacy would be absolutely different to United States approach, and probably should go deeper into it. I cannot actually recall studies on ethics of public diplomacy. That would be great. Another kind of sub-related issue on ethics that was suggested by Lisa is to do experiment on people, whether it is ethically from the research perspective of view or not. I'm in favor, though. So yeah, I believe we have just highlighted one additional avenue on where public diplomacy studies can go, and it is great actually. Thank you.
Thank you, X. I think we've got the last 5 minutes. So Phil, we'll have time for the last question, last few questions. Phil?
Yeah, a couple thoughts to share, and I think there's a question somewhere in here. It's 4 a.m. my time, so my brain is a little not in its full thing. So a couple things that just occurred to me, and as we're talking about this, one, the idea of technology being value neutral, and that these are essentially value neutral affordances that take on the interests and political goals, if you will, of the people who use them. So idealistic countries can have more positive oriented social media uses, whereas more dictatorial or authoritarian states can do the opposite. So I don't want to advocate for social media, but we always point the finger at social media, but it's really about the people who use social media, the publics, the private sector, the governments, and how they're using them. Another thought that I have is, in spite of digital diplomacy and Elon and all these people, I'm not the biggest fan of social only conversations. Just like Lisa said, we live in a very highly integrated communication environment, and you have to think paid, owned, earned, and social, not social, peso, paid, earned, social, and media. Even as Eric said, right, we have traditional diplomacy. Macron needs to go places. Diplomats still need to meet. I don't know why we have all these conversations where we talk only about social. It's such one small part, and we all acknowledge its limitations, even though we talk about two-way engagement and all this stuff with new public diplomacy. There are not enough diplomats. There's not enough people in MFAs to man all these accounts all the time and 24/7. So it's actually very not two-way all the time and centered on the public. That being said, to come back to the centered on the public, as Eric's mentioned, I definitely agree that it's not, and as Nancy mentioned as well, we talk about engagement in PR, they talk about engagement, and the extent to which they follow up on that is not always great. But the one rebuttal I'll have to that is the only reason governments are on social is because that's where the public is. When you're in PR, you follow your publics, you go where they are, and you have X amount of billions of people on social media. That's why governments and public diplomats are there, because they're in an arena where they're trying to get access to the public, and so they follow them there. And then the last thing, and again, I think these are more comments than questions, but the last thing I'll kind of close out with, which I do think has a question wrapped in it. If we ask the question, are social media platforms still viable for public diplomacy? In my mind, the only reason worth asking that question is if you have a follow-up. Well, if they're not, then let's stop using it. And my thoughts on that is, I don't think anyone, while we can ask this question ethically and philosophically and it's not going to matter in the end, because governments will not stop using these platforms. This is where the public is. And I'm as a comm person who has taken IR classes, I try and define myself as I'm an optimistic realist, which is a very horrible state of reality to be in all the time. I see the end goal and I want things to be great, but I also recognize I don't think we'll ever get there, and the world is a deep, dark place. And so I'm in this continuous downward spiral all the time. But if you look at and the IR people can school me a lot better, but I'm not Mearsheimer's biggest fan, but you look at things like offensive realism. Governments will use anything, any asset and anything at their hands that they will use, especially revisionist actors. If dictators and authoritarian states will use it to be controlling and to have this, oppressive control over citizens, I don't see how democracies can say, oh, well, we won't be there because it's not ethically right. They need to be there to try and counter and to try and offset these other type of actors. So again, it's not, as Al said, it's not the best world, but it's where we need to be. And then the last kind of wrap out is, we talk about, or we've been talking about their strengths and their weaknesses. But as Al said, nothing's perfect. You look at international broadcasting, we have the exact same thing. They're government controlled. They're one way. They're all these things that are not idealistic in terms of public diplomacy and two-way engagement, but they're still, in Cull's taxonomy, right? They're one of the 5 major components, right? So whether it's RT being very, whatever you want to get in RT, not the best journalism or not the best government propaganda, whatever you want to call it, versus we've had these same accusations lobbied at Voice of America or the BBC for decades. We have these questions for every single platform, whether it's print, whether it's radio, whether it's satellite, international broadcasting, and just now we're in the social media context. So those are just thoughts that I had. Again, I don't know if I have exact questions wrapped up in those, but be happy to receive any comments back on any of those thoughts.
May I give a brief comment?
Hey, sure.
Philip mentioned that there are people who are not happy with being only in digital only communication framework or universe. However, we're moving there, right? And it is just I will just switch on my prophet mode, and I think that in the nearest future, it would be quite fashionable to gather in groups, people, just normal people, to discuss whatever your lives and leave your phones at home because it is too much. And we will eventually move away, moving away from digital communication will become trendy. However, the problem is that it is very local. So maybe you can gather with your friends in your town, but not gather internationally as we do it today. And it will eventually create some new tasks for states how to listen to those guys who are gathering without their phones. And it's also a very interesting task to see how they will tackle it eventually. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Lisa, you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you for sharing your thoughts, Phil. I think it's important to acknowledge that traditional diplomacy always precedes public diplomacy. So we are all observers of traditional diplomacy. So we watch how our country's leaders interact with and form policies and collaborations with leaders of other countries. These events that are normally reported in the news media can potentially have greater effects than what people see on social media. But these days, we see a lot of conflicts going on between countries, like Australia asserting Australia first, America asserting America first. And as a result of these diplomatic events that show that countries are not collaborating, or one country trying to assert its own interest on another country, meaning that it's trying to overpower another country, it's important that we have social media platforms where embassies and consulates still try hard to actually tell the world that there are still some collaborations going on between countries. But it will be interesting to look into how people actually perceive these different events going on. So so on one hand, we have collaborations going on the other hand, we also have conflicts going on. It will be quite interesting to explore in future research how people actually perceive these conflicting collaborations and disagreements.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I guess we have time for one last question, if there's any. All right. So then I guess, yeah, we can conclude here because we are like 3 minutes after the deadline we gave us. I think it was, yeah, we touched like so many things. It was such a great discussion. So thank you very much, Lisa and Eric, for for the effort of preparing your speech and also for answering and responding to all our question and comments. Some of them so it's some of them are like very big questions, so thank you very much. And remember just that we hopefully we're gonna all see ICA in Paris this year. It's a wish at the moment, so hopefully we're gonna be able to meet again in the conferences. So thank you very much for everyone, all people that have attended, for all people that woke up early in the morning to join us. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, since we are at the end of the year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much, all.